And we'll move to the battlefield. Much of the public conversation we hear about conflict is about armies, air power, terror groups, territory lost and gained. But while troops are on the ground and drones are in the air, there's one battlefield that's always active, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. It's cyber war, where the enemy is untraceable and the rules are vague. So how do you prepare? Our defense correspondent Shai Ben-ari brings us an inside look at Israel's latest simulation.
A fairly unusual sort of war game. The IDF C4I Corps Cyber Defense Unit held a drill Wednesday aimed at training the Israeli Army's next generation of cyber warfare officers. But this particular exercise, codenamed Coliseum, was held under a different sort of banner, or banners, as the case may be, with cyber cadets and soldiers divided into teams named after the various noble houses of HBO's popular fantasy series, Game of Thrones. While the different houses practiced their cyber skills by attacking and defending against each other, Israel's cyber enemies were represented by the White Walkers, who in this case attempted to penetrate a firewall instead of a wall of ice.
We are using the world of fantasy, Game of Thrones, to create an interesting twist, something the soldiers and cadets are unfamiliar with. We simulate attacks by different houses, and each team must defend in the name of a certain house. And that's how we develop a certain competitive edge here.
Fantasy aside, the drill provided IDF cyber cadets with critical experience in handling non-simulated threats by giving each cadet control over a team of 3 cyber defenders.
This is the first real taste of command for these cadets. In terms of responsibility over other soldiers, we bring in cyber defenders from the Army's different units and allow the cadets to command a team of defenders representing different branches and enable them to learn defense techniques developed in the different units.
While the cadets were required to use their technical expertise as cyber warriors and defenders, in the context of the drill, they also had to develop a tactical awareness, requiring a broader outlook while taking into account the possible benefits and consequences of different actions. It's a relatively new and unfamiliar arena, but the principles of warfare are largely unchanged.
Senior defense correspondent Shai Ben-ari with me now. Good evening, Shai. We're talking about cyber warfare. This is a field that is not new, that Israel has been on top of, or at least trying to lead in for years.
Right. Israel is really one of the countries at the forefront of cyber technology on both the military and civilian levels, as is Iran, interestingly enough, and worryingly to a certain degree. The IDF is particularly worried about an attack on civilian infrastructure before the military level, really. For example, on electricity, on water, on transportation systems, banks, cellular technology. We've seen those kinds of attacks before, not in the pretty recent past. In different countries, we had both in December 2015, you had in Turkey a major cyber attack targeted the banking system in that country. It eventually led to a shutdown of the internet in general. Also that month, a major attack in Ukraine, which shut down a number of different power stations and even the international airport.
And it's easy to sort of forget because we are so connected. Everything about our lives and infrastructure is increasingly online, and that is a threat. That's a sort of type of declaration of war that's at the touch of a button, so to speak.
And that's a very problematic field when you talk also about the legal aspects of rule of war. Really, when you talk about that aspect of it, when you have actors who are semi-state actors, for example, hackers who take it upon themselves to perhaps act in the name of a state or some sort of organization, does that necessarily classify it as an act of war? I'm not sure there are really answers to these questions because this is such a developing field. I'm not sure the legal experts and legislators can keep up to date.
So beyond the civilian infrastructure, what is Israel focused on in terms of military systems? Certainly that's on top of the list of threats too.
It's certainly up there as well, though they're primarily concerned about the civilian sphere. There is some concern about infiltration into military systems. Also, when you talk about espionage in terms of figuring out how systems work, as well as trying to damage systems similar to what we saw with the Stuxnet virus in Iran. This doesn't necessarily have to be an enemy country perpetrating this kind of threat. We saw a little while ago, there were revelations coming originally from Edward Snowden about a joint US and UK program by the NSA and GCHQ to hack into the Israeli drone program. The objective there, and it was going on for years, was to actually keep tabs on Israeli plans to attack Iran. So we see that there's a certain, that cyber defense really has a counter-espionage
And
element
behind
to
the
it.
scenes, you sort of have this constant situation of governments and militaries trying to catch up, maybe, with hackers that can do this sort of, maybe not on their own, but with far less infrastructure, with far less money than
Right.
governments have to fight that threat.
Right, of course. You have, obviously, this is an activity sort of driven by a very youthful sort of demographic. Most of these guys are in their late teens, let's say, early 20s. That's why it's actually fairly convenient to have that same age group going into the military. A lot of the emphasis here from the Israeli perspective is being put on this group. There's a whole new cyber branch of the military with 8 different teams set up, mainly on the defensive, to counter these kinds of threats.
And on top of the threats, you mentioned Iran. Who else might Israel be looking to?
There's also, of course, the issue of Russia. We know that the